Desire rarely announces itself as danger. It arrives quietly, disguised as motivation, curiosity, or comfort. A small pull towards something that promises relief, pleasure, or meaning. In the beginning, it feels harmless, sometimes even necessary. The brain welcomes it because desire is written deep into human biology. It is how we learn, survive, and seek reward. But desire is not just a feeling. It is a chemical prediction. Inside the brain, certain signals whisper that something important is coming soon. Not now, but soon. Dopamine rises, not because the reward has arrived, but because it is expected. The future begins to feel more real than the present, and the brain starts leaning forward, chasing a moment that always seems just one step away. This is where addiction begins, not with excess, but with repetition. Each time desire is followed by relief, the brain learns faster, pathways strengthen, signals sharpen. What once felt optional slowly becomes automatic. The brain does not ask times why times anymore. It only remembers times what worked before asterisk. Over time, the chemistry shifts. The reward loses its brightness, but the craving grows stronger. Satisfaction shortens. Absence hurts more. What once created pleasure now simply prevents discomfort. And without realizing it, the brain begins protecting the very patterns that cause suffering. Addiction is not a failure of character. It is not weakness, and it is not lack of discipline. It is the result of a learning system that adapts too well. A brain that is doing exactly what it was designed to do: optimize relief, predict reward, and avoid pain. In this journey, we will explore the hidden chemistry behind desire, how the brain creates craving, why repetition reshapes choice, and how habits quietly take control, slowly, gently, without judgment. Because understanding the chemistry of desire is not about blame, it is about awareness. And awareness is where change begins. Desire begins long before we are aware of it. Before thought, before decision, before intention. Deep inside the brain, networks quietly evaluate the world for significance. They scan for patterns, opportunities, threats, and possibilities. This process never sleeps. Even now, as the mind begins to soften, the brain continues its silent calculation, deciding what matters and what can fade into the background. Desire is not chosen. It emerges automatically as the brain highlights something it believes could change the internal state. At the center of this process is prediction. The brain is not a passive observer of reality. It is a forecasting machine. Every sensation, memory, and emotion is filtered through a simple question. Asterisk. What might happen next? Asterisk. When the brain detects something associated with relief, pleasure, or reward, it begins preparing the body and mind in advance. This preparation is chemical. Dopamine does not create pleasure itself, it creates anticipation. It stretches the mind forward in time, pulling attention away from the present moment and toward a possibility that feels important, even necessary. This is why desire can feel so compelling. It narrows awareness. Thoughts orbit around a single expectation. The brain subtly shifts priorities, reducing sensitivity to everything else. Hunger becomes quieter. Fatigue fades temporarily. Discomfort recedes. All of this happens without conscious permission. The brain has learned that focusing intensely on one thing increases the chance of reaching it. Desire is simply the brain doing its job efficiently. What makes this process powerful is how quickly it learns. When anticipation is followed by relief, even once the brain records the sequence, the environment, the emotion, the internal state, and the outcome become linked. The next time a similar situation appears, the brain reacts faster. Desire activates sooner, stronger, and with less ambiguity. Over time, this reaction becomes less about choice and more about memory replaying itself. The present is no longer evaluated on its own terms. It is compared to a remembered solution. As this loop strengthens, desire begins to detach from its original purpose. What once guided behavior now drives it. The brain no longer asks whether the reward still serves the body or mind. It only remembers that it once reduced discomfort. This is not a flaw. It is a consequence of a system optimized for survival in uncertain environments. In ancient conditions, repeating what worked could mean the difference between safety and danger. The brain still operates by those rules. Understanding this changes how desire is perceived. It is not an enemy, and it is not a moral failure. Desire is a signal, a biological echo of past relief. When repeated often enough, that echo grows louder than the present moment, and without awareness, it can begin shaping behavior from beneath consciousness, guiding actions while the mind believes it is freely choosing. This is where the chemistry of desire quietly lays its foundation, long before anything feels like addiction. Anticipation is the true engine of desire, not the reward itself, but the space just before it. Inside the brain, this space is chemically alive. Dopamine rises not when something is consumed, but when it is expected. The mind leans forward, subtly detaching from the present moment. Time begins to stretch. The future gains weight, while the now becomes thin and quiet. This is why desire feels urgent, even when nothing is happening yet. The brain is already living in a moment that has not arrived. This chemical shift alters perception. Colors feel slightly brighter. Thoughts become narrower, more focused. The body prepares as if something important is about to occur. Heart rate adjusts. Muscles hold a faint readiness. Attention locks onto cues that point toward the anticipated outcome. Everything else fades into background noise. The brain is not being dramatic, it is being efficient. Anticipation reorganizes mental resources around a single predicted event. What makes anticipation so powerful is uncertainty. Dopamine responds most strongly when the reward is not guaranteed. When outcomes vary, the brain becomes hyper-attuned. Each small signal, each reminder, each fragment of memory can trigger a wave of expectation. This is why desire often grows stronger when satisfaction is delayed or inconsistent. The brain keeps asking, asterisk, is it now? Is it soon? Asterisk. And with each unanswered question, anticipation intensifies. Over repeated cycles, the brain begins to associate specific internal states with anticipation itself. Stress, boredom, loneliness, fatigue, these states quietly become invitations, not because they feel good, but because they once led to relief. The brain does not distinguish between healthy comfort and harmful escape. It only tracks chemical change. If anticipation once softened discomfort, the brain will recreate it again, automatically. At this stage, desire is no longer about pleasure. It is about regulation. The brain uses anticipation to manage internal balance, to escape unease, to restore familiarity. The chemical promise becomes more important than the outcome. Even when the reward disappoints, anticipation remains convincing. This is why desire can persist long after satisfaction fades. the chemistry speaks louder than experience. Slowly, almost invisibly, anticipation becomes self-sustaining. The brain learns to crave the rise itself, the lift, the pull, the forward motion of expectation. And without awareness, this motion begins to repeat on its own, looping quietly beneath consciousness. This is how the chemistry of desire deepens its hold, not through intensity, but through repetition and prediction. At first, repetition feels harmless. The same action, the same behavior, the same relief again and again. The brain welcomes repetition because repetition simplifies reality. Each time a familiar pattern appears, the brain spends less energy evaluating it. Pathways strengthen, signals travel faster. What once required attention now unfolds automatically. This is not addiction yet. This is learning. The brain is designed to conserve effort, to store shortcuts, to remember what reduced discomfort before. With each repetition, the experience becomes less about the present moment and more about memory activating itself. Inside the brain, repetition reshapes structure. Neural circuits that fire together begin to wire together. Anticipation, action, and relief merge into a single sequence, compressed into a rapid cascade of signals. The mind no longer experiences these steps separately. There is no clear beginning or end, only a smooth slide from urge to behavior. Conscious awareness arrives late, often after the decision has already been made. The brain does not announce this shift. It simply adjusts efficiency, quietly favoring what it has learned to expect. As repetition continues, the brain's relationship with time changes. Past experiences gain influence over present choices. Memory stops being a record and starts becoming a guide. When a familiar internal state appears, tension, restlessness, emptiness, the brain does not analyze it. It recognizes it, and recognition triggers response. The solution that once worked rises automatically, carrying with it the faint echo of anticipated relief. Desire now feels less like wanting and more like remembering. This is where control begins to blur. The mind may still believe it is choosing, but the choice is being framed by chemistry shaped over time. Alternatives feel distant, vague, unconvincing. They lack the emotional weight of familiarity. The repeated path feels safe not because it is beneficial, but because it is known. The brain equates familiarity with survival. What is known feels predictable. What is predictable feels less threatening, and so repetition is reinforced, not by pleasure, but by certainty. Eventually, repetition transforms desire into habit, and habit into expectation. The brain stops asking whether the outcome is still effective. It only confirms that the sequence exists. Memory becomes momentum. Each cycle strengthens the belief that relief lies just ahead, even as actual satisfaction grows weaker. This is how desire slowly detaches from its original purpose and becomes self-perpetuating, no longer responding to need, but to the memory of need. At this stage, the chemistry of desire is no longer loud or dramatic. It is quiet, efficient, almost invisible. The brain runs the program in the background while awareness drifts elsewhere. And because nothing feels extreme yet, nothing feels wrong. This is the most dangerous moment, not because of intensity, but because of normality. The behavior feels familiar, the pull feels natural, and the brain, doing exactly what it was trained to do, continues to repeat what it remembers. Over time, something subtle begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that it often goes unnoticed. The brain no longer waits for desire to fully form before acting. The space between urge and behavior collapses. What once felt like a decision now feels like momentum. The body moves first, and awareness follows behind, trying to explain what has already happened. This is not loss of control in the way people imagine it. It is the gradual outsourcing of choice to a system that has learned too well. Inside the brain, this shift reflects a transfer of authority. Regions responsible for conscious evaluation, those that weigh consequences, delay action, and imagine alternatives, begin to disengage from frequently repeated behaviors. They are not damaged, they are simply bypassed. The brain has determined that analysis is unnecessary. The pattern has proven itself reliable in the past, and reliability is rewarded with speed. Faster reactions feel safer, slower reflection feels risky, and so, the chemistry favors immediacy. As this happens, desire no longer announces itself as craving. It appears as inevitability, a quiet sense that something times happen, rather than times happen. The mind rationalizes after the fact, constructing explanations that preserve the illusion of choice. But underneath these explanations, the sequence continues to run automatically. Trigger, anticipation, action, relief, over and over. Each repetition reinforcing the belief that there is no alternative path. What makes this stage so powerful is that nothing feels extreme. There is no dramatic suffering yet, no obvious collapse. Life continues, responsibilities are met, relationships persist. This normality disguises the shift. The brain interprets the absence of crisis as confirmation that the pattern is safe, and so it tightens its grip, not through force, but through familiarity. What is familiar feels neutral. What feels neutral escapes scrutiny. Gradually, the emotional range narrows. Experiences that once brought natural satisfaction lose their intensity, not because they are meaningless, but because they do not activate the learned chemical sequence. They feel distant, muted, less convincing. Meanwhile, the familiar behavior continues to promise relief, even as it delivers less each time. The brain responds by amplifying anticipation, not by questioning the pattern. The loop accelerates while satisfaction fades. At this point, desire has fully transformed. It is no longer a signal pointing towards something beneficial. It is a reflex, a learned response to internal states the brain wants to escape. Choice has not vanished, it has been buried beneath layers of memory, prediction, and chemistry. And because this process unfolds slowly, quietly, and without obvious pain, it often remains invisible until it has already shaped behavior for years. This is the moment where understanding becomes essential. Because once the brain has automated desire, change no longer begins with willpower. It begins with awareness, with recognizing that what feels like instinct is often memory in motion. And only by seeing this clearly can the chemistry of desire begin to loosen its hold. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure, but in reality, it is the chemical of times becoming asterisk. It does not reward the present moment. It points toward the future. Inside the brain, dopamine functions as a signal that something important is approaching, something worth moving toward, something that could change the internal state. When dopamine rises, it does not say, "times this feels good, asterisk." It says, "times this could matter, asterisk." And that distinction is everything. It is why dopamine can be powerful even when pleasure fades. This chemical signal reshapes attention. The mind begins to organize itself around what is anticipated rather than what is experienced. Thoughts become narrower, more directed. Sensory input that does not relate to the expected outcome becomes quieter, less relevant. Time itself seems to stretch forward. The present moment thins, while the future gains emotional gravity. This is not imagination, it is chemistry altering perception. The brain, preparing for a potential reward, reallocates its resources toward pursuit. What makes dopamine so persuasive is its relationship with uncertainty. The brain releases dopamine most strongly when the outcome is unpredictable. When reward is guaranteed, anticipation weakens. But when reward is possible, when it might happen or might not, the signal intensifies. The brain leans in. It watches more closely. It becomes more alert. This is why repeated cycles of partial satisfaction can feel more compelling than consistent pleasure. Uncertainty keeps the promise alive. Over time, the brain begins to associate dopamine not just with external rewards, but with internal states. Stress, boredom, emptiness, and fatigue become cues. These states quietly suggest that something is missing, that balance could be restored. Dopamine responds by pointing toward whatever previously reduced that discomfort. The brain does not evaluate whether the solution is healthy or harmful. It only remembers that it worked once, and memory, when paired with chemistry, is persuasive. As this process repeats, the promise carried by dopamine becomes detached from reality. The anticipation remains strong even as the reward loses its effect. The brain continues to predict change, relief, or satisfaction long after experience has stopped confirming it. This is the quiet power of dopamine. It does not care about outcomes. It cares about movement, forward motion. The belief that something better lies just ahead. Eventually, dopamine stops serving as a guide and begins acting as a driver. Behavior becomes oriented around chasing the promise rather than evaluating the result. The brain learns to trust anticipation more than experience. And in this subtle shift, desire gains momentum of its own, propelled not by pleasure, but by the chemistry of expectation. Dopamine has no memory of fulfillment. It does not register completion, closure, or enough. Its role is not to confirm that a need has been met, but to keep the organism moving forward. Once the anticipated outcome arrives, dopamine rapidly declines, not as a punishment, but as a signal that its job is done. The moment satisfaction begins, dopamine steps aside. This creates a strange paradox inside the brain. The closer one gets to relief, the quieter dopamine becomes. What follows is not peace, but absence, and absence quickly feels like lack. This chemical design explains why satisfaction can feel so brief, even when the reward itself is intense. Pleasure lives in different systems, slower, deeper, more stabilizing. Dopamine, by contrast, is restless. It pushes attention forward, then withdraws. The mind is left scanning again, searching for the next promise. The brain interprets this silence not as completion, but as a new signal. Asterisk, something else is needed. Asterisk. And so the cycle quietly restarts. As repetition continues, the brain adapts. Dopamine receptors become less sensitive. The same anticipation produces a weaker signal, but instead of questioning the pattern, the brain compensates by amplifying desire. It leans harder into prediction, increases focus, sharpens craving. The result is familiar: more effort for less effect. The promise feels urgent, yet fulfillment feels shallow. This is not failure, it is adaptation. The brain is adjusting to constant stimulation by raising the threshold for excitement. This adaptation shifts the emotional landscape. Calm begins to feel flat. Neutral states feel uncomfortable. The absence of anticipation starts to resemble boredom, even emptiness. The brain, now accustomed to frequent dopamine rises, interprets stillness as deficiency. It seeks movement, novelty, escalation, not because something is wrong, but because chemistry has learned to expect intensity. Desire grows louder precisely when satisfaction grows quieter. What makes this process so convincing is that it feels logical from the inside. The mind assumes that the solution to fading satisfaction is stronger reward, more intensity, more frequency, more control. But dopamine does not respond to fulfillment, it responds to possibility. Each attempt to restore the original feeling only reinforces the chase. The brain learns that the answer is always just ahead, never here. Over time, this creates a subtle tension that never fully resolves. A background sense that something is missing, even when life appears stable. Dopamine keeps the system oriented toward future relief, while the present moment feels increasingly insufficient. This is how desire becomes endless, not because pleasure is absent, but because the chemistry driving pursuit cannot recognize completion. Understanding this changes everything. The problem is not wanting too much. The problem is mistaking anticipation for fulfillment. Dopamine promises relief, but it was never designed to deliver it. And when the brain forgets this distinction, desire becomes a horizon that moves farther away with every step toward it. The brain is remarkably skilled at convincing itself that relief is always just one step away. Dopamine plays a central role in creating this illusion. It does not measure reality, it measures expectation. Each rise in dopamine paints the future with emotional color, making the imagined outcome feel vivid, important, and close. The mind begins to react to what might happen as if it already has. This is why anticipation can feel more powerful than the reward itself. The illusion forms before experience has a chance to intervene. As this process repeats, the brain starts trusting prediction over evidence. Even when the reward consistently disappoints, dopamine continues to signal possibility. The memory of early relief lingers, amplified by chemistry. The brain clings to that memory, not because it is accurate, but because it once solved a problem. Over time, experience becomes quieter than expectation. The mind listens less to what is happening now and more to what once happened before. This is how illusion gains authority. The brain reinforces this illusion through selective attention. Signals that confirm the promise are highlighted, while signals that contradict it fade into the background. Small moments of relief are magnified. Long stretches of dissatisfaction are minimized or forgotten. The pattern appears functional, even when it is not. The brain is not lying, it is simplifying. It protects the illusion because the illusion maintains movement, and movement feels safer than stillness. This distortion of perception reshapes emotional memory. The brain remembers wanting more clearly than having. Desire becomes sharper than satisfaction. The anticipation phase leaves a deeper imprint than the outcome. As a result, the mind begins to crave the build-up rather than the release. The illusion strengthens not through pleasure, but through contrast. Each letdown quietly reinforces the belief that the next time's time will be different. Eventually, the illusion detaches completely from reality. The reward no longer needs to deliver anything meaningful. The promise alone is enough to trigger behavior. Dopamine continues to rise in response to cues, memories, and internal states. Even as the actual experience becomes dull or empty, the brain does not notice the mismatch. It only feels the pull. At this stage, desire is no longer about satisfaction. It is about hope engineered by chemistry, a hope that persists even when evidence disappears. The illusion of reward keeps the system running, turning repetition into belief and belief into behavior. And because this illusion feels internal, automatic, and familiar, it is rarely questioned. Recognizing this illusion is unsettling. It reveals that what feels like longing is often memory replaying itself under chemical influence. But within this recognition lies the first quiet opening, because once the illusion is seen clearly, it loses some of its power. The chemistry of desire depends on invisibility. Awareness brings it into the light, where it can no longer operate unnoticed. At a certain point, anticipation, action, and outcome stop feeling like separate moments and begin to merge into a single continuous experience. The brain no longer registers clear boundaries between wanting, doing, and receiving. Dopamine rises, behavior follows, relief appears briefly, and before awareness has time to settle, anticipation is already forming again. This creates the sensation of motion without arrival, of movement without rest. The loop closes not with force, but with smoothness. Each cycle feels natural, expected, almost inevitable. The brain interprets this seamless flow as stability, even though it never truly resolves. The absence of resolution does not register as a problem, it registers as normal. And because it feels normal, it escapes attention. Within this closed loop, the brain begins to protect the pattern itself rather than the outcome it once promised. The original purpose of desire fades into the background. What remains is momentum. Triggers no longer need to be external. Internal states are enough. A subtle shift in mood, a moment of emptiness, a trace of discomfort, and the loop activates on its own. The brain anticipates relief before the mind can ask whether relief is needed. Action follows quickly, almost reflexively, driven by chemistry that has learned to associate motion with safety. The loop sustains itself because stopping feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity feels risky. Stillness begins to carry unease. Absence of anticipation feels like something is wrong, even when nothing is. As this cycle repeats, the brain's perception of satisfaction continues to erode. Relief becomes shorter, thinner, less convincing, yet anticipation grows stronger, more urgent, more demanding. The system compensates for diminishing returns by increasing intensity and frequency. More becomes necessary to achieve less. This imbalance does not feel dramatic from the inside. It feels like persistence, like commitment, like needing to try harder. The brain does not question the logic because the logic is chemical, not rational. Dopamine continues to promise change, and the promise alone is enough to keep the loop intact. Over time, this closed circuit reshapes emotional experience. Joy feels muted, calm feels empty, neutral states feel uncomfortable. The brain, conditioned to constant forward motion, interprets stillness as deprivation. The loop becomes the default way of regulating internal state, even as it fails to provide lasting relief. This is the quiet entrapment of desire, not a collapse, not a crisis, but a narrowing, a gradual shrinking of options until one path feels obvious and all others feel vague and unconvincing. By the time the loop is fully closed, desire no longer feels like wanting something specific. It feels like needing movement itself. The brain is no longer chasing pleasure or meaning. It is avoiding the discomfort of stopping. This is the final transformation of dopamine's promise. What began as a guide toward potential reward becomes a self-sustaining circuit, driven by anticipation, reinforced by memory, and protected by familiarity. And because this loop operates beneath conscious awareness, it can persist for years without being named. This is where addiction stops being about the object of desire and becomes about the chemistry that keeps desire alive. Most addiction does not feel like being trapped. It feels like continuity, a familiar rhythm the brain slips into without resistance. There is no sharp edge, no clear moment where control is lost. Instead, there is flow. Trigger leads to anticipation. Anticipation slides into action. Action dissolves into brief relief, and relief quietly gives way to absence. The brain does not label this sequence as a loop. It experiences it as a single, extended response to the world. Something happens inside, something is done, something eases, then life moves on. The danger of the loop is not its intensity, but its invisibility. What makes this loop so difficult to detect is how well it integrates into normal functioning. Responsibilities are still met, conversations still happen, days pass without obvious collapse. The brain interprets this stability as proof that nothing is wrong. It does not register the narrowing of options, only the reliability of one familiar response. Over time, the loop becomes the default way the brain regulates internal state, not because it works well, but because it works consistently. Consistency feels safe. Safety feels correct. And so the loop tightens without resistance. Inside the brain, this process reflects a shift from evaluation to automation. The systems responsible for habit formation quietly take over, freeing conscious awareness from repeated decision-making. The brain learns that thinking is unnecessary here. The outcome is predictable enough. Energy can be conserved. Choice fades not through force, but through efficiency. The loop becomes faster, smoother, more silent. Awareness arrives later each time, often only to observe what has already happened. This delayed awareness creates the illusion that nothing is wrong, because nothing feels chaotic. Everything feels orderly, and order feels reassuring. As the loop repeats, it begins to shape emotional expectation. Certain internal states start to feel incomplete unless the sequence runs its course. Restlessness carries an undertone of urgency. Calm feels unstable. Stillness feels unfamiliar. The brain subtly resists moments where nothing happens because nothing interrupts the loop. Silence becomes uncomfortable, not because it is empty, but because it offers no cue for action. The loop has taught the brain that movement equals regulation. Without movement, chemistry drifts into unease. What makes this stage especially powerful is the absence of suffering that would demand attention. Pain comes later. Loss comes later. Consequences accumulate slowly, quietly, often unnoticed until they feel irreversible. In the meantime, the loop continues to function well enough to remain unquestioned. The brain protects it, not out of attachment to pleasure, but out of fear of disruption. The loop is familiar. Familiarity feels like control, and so the brain keeps returning to it again and again, believing it is maintaining balance. By the time the addiction loop becomes visible, it has already reshaped perception, memory, and expectation. What once felt like desire now feels like necessity. What once felt optional now feels inevitable. The loop no longer announces itself, it simply runs. And because it runs smoothly, silently, and without drama, it can govern behavior for years before it is ever named. This is the most deceptive phase of addiction, not the loss of control, but the feeling that control was never needed. Once the addiction loop is established, speed becomes its greatest advantage. What began as a gradual sequence now compresses itself in time. The gap between trigger and response narrows until it almost disappears. The brain learns to recognize patterns earlier, reacting not to events themselves, but to the faintest signals that precede them. A thought, a memory, a bodily sensation, sometimes nothing more than a subtle emotional shift, is enough to activate the entire circuit. The mind is barely aware of what is happening because awareness is slower than habit. By the time consciousness arrives, the loop is already in motion. This acceleration is not chaotic. It is refined. Each repetition removes friction. The brain trims away hesitation, doubt, and reflection, replacing them with smooth transitions and automatic responses. Efficiency increases. What once required preparation now unfolds instantly. The loop becomes quieter as it becomes faster. There is less internal dialogue, fewer questions, fewer pauses. Silence replaces conflict, and silence is often mistaken for peace. The brain interprets the absence of struggle as improvement, not realizing that choice has been streamlined out of the process. As the loop accelerates, emotional sensitivity begins to shift. The brain becomes less responsive to subtle forms of reward and more dependent on the loop for regulation. Everyday experiences, conversation, rest, accomplishment, connection, feel insufficiently activating. They do not generate the familiar chemical motion. The loop, by contrast, delivers immediate change. Anticipation rises quickly. Relief arrives predictably. The brain learns to prefer this rapid modulation of internal state over slower, more natural forms of satisfaction. Speed becomes synonymous with effectiveness. This preference reshapes attention. The mind grows impatient with anything that does not immediately alter internal chemistry. Waiting feels uncomfortable. Delays feel irritating. The brain has adapted to rapid resolution and begins to resist environments that demand stillness or tolerance of discomfort. The loop offers escape from this discomfort, reinforcing its own necessity. Each fast cycle strengthens the belief that regulation must be immediate. Slowness begins to feel unsafe. Over time, this acceleration creates a sense of urgency that seems to come from nowhere. Desire appears suddenly, fully formed, without build-up or explanation. The brain no longer signals craving, it executes response. This can feel like compulsion, but it often feels simpler than that. It feels like inevitability. The mind does not argue because it no longer sees an alternative. The loop has become the fastest, most reliable way to return to familiarity, and familiarity feels like stability. As speed increases, depth follows. The loop embeds itself more deeply into neural architecture, drawing energy away from systems that support reflection and long-term planning. The brain reallocates resources toward what it uses most. This is not damage, it is adaptation. The brain adapts to what is practiced, And when the loop is practiced daily, hourly, even silently in thought, it becomes the dominant pattern. Everything else begins to feel secondary. Eventually, the loop no longer needs strong triggers. It runs on momentum alone. Anticipation arises without cause. Action follows without thought. Relief fades quickly, restarting the cycle. The system sustains itself not through pleasure, but through speed. The faster the loop runs, the harder it is to see. And the harder it is to see, the more powerful it becomes. This is how addiction deepens, not through intensity, but through acceleration. At a certain depth, the addiction loop no longer presents itself as a source of relief, but as a form of protection. The brain begins to associate the absence of the loop with risk, not conscious danger, not logical threat, but chemical instability. When the familiar sequence pauses, even briefly, the nervous system reacts as if something essential is missing. Restlessness rises without explanation. Thoughts scatter. The body feels slightly off, unanchored, uneasy. This discomfort does not feel like craving yet. It feels like imbalance. And the brain, trained to restore balance quickly, searches for the fastest solution it knows. What makes stopping feel dangerous is not the loss of pleasure, but the loss of predictability. The loop has become the brain's most reliable regulator. It knows exactly what will happen when the sequence begins. Anticipation rises, action follows, relief arrives, at least briefly. Without this sequence, the brain is forced to remain with uncertainty. And uncertainty activates ancient systems designed to detect threat. The chemistry shifts toward vigilance. Muscles tighten. Attention fragments. The mind looks for escape. In this state, returning to the loop feels less like indulgence and more like self-preservation. As this association strengthens, the brain begins to interpret stillness as exposure. Quiet moments become uncomfortable. Gaps in stimulation feel heavy. The absence of anticipation creates a vacuum the brain rushes to fill. The loop promises immediate structure in this emptiness. It offers direction, motion, familiarity. Even when the outcome disappoints, the act of moving toward it feels stabilizing. The brain learns that doing something times is safer than doing nothing, even if that something causes harm over time. This is where resistance weakens, not because the person lacks strength, but because resistance itself begins to feel destabilizing. Saying no introduces uncertainty. Waiting introduces discomfort. The loop, by contrast, restores order instantly. The brain does not weigh long-term consequences here. It responds to immediate internal signals. Chemistry demands resolution, and the loop delivers it quickly. Each time the loop resolves discomfort, it reinforces the belief that stopping is unsafe. Over time, this belief embeds itself beneath awareness. The mind may consciously want change, but the nervous system reacts as if change is a threat. Attempts to pause the behavior are met with internal friction, unease, agitation, emotional noise. These sensations are often misinterpreted as proof that something is wrong, rather than signs of a system adjusting. The brain mistakes withdrawal from familiarity for danger, and urges return not out of desire, but out of fear. Eventually, the loop no longer needs to promise pleasure at all. Its primary function becomes avoidance of discomfort. The brain is no longer chasing reward, it is fleeing instability. Desire transforms into urgency. Choice transforms into relief-seeking. The loop tightens its grip not through temptation, but through protection. It convinces the brain that it is necessary for balance, even as it quietly erodes it. This is the quiet turning point of addiction, when stopping feels worse than continuing, when absence feels more threatening than repetition, when the loop is no longer something the brain wants, but something it believes it needs. And because this belief lives in chemistry rather than thought, it can persist even in the presence of insight, logic, and intention. Understanding this is essential not to induce fear, but to recognize why change feels so difficult. The danger is not in stopping. The danger is in what the brain has learned to believe about stopping. At the deepest stage of the addiction loop, something more subtle than behavior changes begins to shift. The loop stops being something the brain does times and starts becoming something the brain is asterisk. Actions no longer feel like responses to desire. They feel like expressions of self. The mind quietly integrates the pattern into its sense of normality. This is just how I am, the inner narrative suggests, not as resignation, but as explanation. The loop blends into identity so smoothly that separating from it feels like erasing part of oneself. This fusion happens because the brain relies on consistency to define the self. What repeats feels stable. What feels stable feels personal. Over time, memories, emotions, routines, and expectations begin to orbit around the loop. The brain organizes experience in relation to it before, during, after. Time itself becomes structured by anticipation and relief. Without noticing, the loop becomes a reference point, a psychological anchor. Removing it threatens not just comfort, but coherence. The brain resists this threat instinctively. As identity forms around the loop, alternatives feel abstract and unconvincing. Change is no longer evaluated as a new option. It is experienced as loss. The brain imagines absence rather than possibility. Without the loop, something essential seems missing, even if it was never healthy to begin with. This imagined absence carries emotional weight. Fear, sadness, and confusion arise, not because the loop is good, but because it is familiar. Familiarity masquerades as authenticity. The brain mistakes repetition for truth. This is where shame often enters quietly, not as judgment from the outside, but as an internal pressure. The mind senses the mismatch between desire for change and the pull of the loop, and interprets this tension as personal failure. But shame does not weaken the loop, it strengthens it. Shame increases discomfort, and discomfort activates the very pattern the brain relies on for regulation. The loop absorbs the emotion meant to challenge it, using it as fuel to persist. At this stage, willpower alone feels ineffective because the conflict is no longer behavioral, it is existential. Stopping does not feel like quitting a habit. It feels like abandoning a part of the self. The brain defends against this threat automatically. It generates justifications, narratives, and emotional responses that preserve continuity. These defenses are not lies. They are protective reflexes designed to maintain identity stability. Understanding this transformation is essential because it reframes the struggle entirely. Addiction is not simply about desire or pleasure. It is about how chemistry, repetition, and memory collaborate to construct identity over time. The loop does not dominate through force, it assimilates. And because it feels internal, personal, and familiar, it becomes difficult to distinguish where the loop ends and the self begins. But this fusion is not permanent. Identity is not fixed chemistry. It is an evolving pattern. What was learned can be unlearned. What was integrated can be gently separated. Recognition is the first crack in the structure. Not confrontation, not condemnation, just seeing clearly that what feels like me is often a system that learned too well. And once this is seen, the loop no longer owns the story. It becomes something that can be observed, understood, and eventually released. Tolerance does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, almost politely, adjusting expectations without drawing attention to itself. What once felt sufficient begins to feel incomplete. The brain remembers the intensity of early experiences and measures the present against that memory, not against reality. Each repetition dulls the response, just enough to go unnoticed at first. Relief still comes, but it is thinner. Satisfaction still appears, but it fades more quickly. The brain does not interpret this as loss, it interprets it as a signal to increase effort. More becomes the obvious solution to less. Inside the brain, this adjustment reflects a fundamental principle of adaptation. Neural systems recalibrate to repeated stimulation by reducing sensitivity. Receptors respond less strongly. Signals weaken. This is not damage, it is efficiency. The brain is conserving balance in an environment it perceives as overstimulated. But from the inside, this recalibration feels like hunger, a subtle sense that something is missing, even immediately after relief. The satisfaction that once lingered now evaporates quickly, leaving behind a quiet dissatisfaction that demands resolution. As tolerance increases, desire becomes more demanding. The brain raises its threshold for change, requiring greater intensity, frequency, or novelty to produce the same internal shift. What once felt optional now feels necessary. The mind begins to justify escalation logically. Asterisk just this once, asterisk, asterisk just a little more, asterisk, asterisk this should be enough, asterisk. Each justification feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a pattern of gradual expansion. The brain is not chasing pleasure anymore, it is chasing equilibrium. And equilibrium keeps drifting further away. This growing hunger reshapes emotional experience. The baseline state begins to feel uncomfortable, flat, or empty. Calm loses its warmth. Stillness feels unproductive. The absence of stimulation becomes noticeable, even distressing. The brain, now accustomed to frequent chemical shifts, interprets neutrality as deprivation. Hunger is no longer about wanting something specific, it is about needing something to change. Anything. Movement becomes relief, regardless of direction. What makes tolerance so deceptive is that it rarely triggers alarm. There is no clear moment where the brain announces that enough is no longer enough. Instead, dissatisfaction becomes normalized. The individual adapts alongside the chemistry, adjusting expectations without realizing how far they have shifted. The original reference point disappears. The new normal feels simply like reality. And because the brain believes this hunger reflects a genuine need, it continues to feed it, unaware that the hunger itself is a product of adaptation. Over time, tolerance transforms desire into urgency. The space for reflection shrinks. Waiting becomes difficult. Delays feel heavier. The brain pushes for immediate resolution, convinced that relief lies just beyond the next repetition. But each cycle delivers less, demanding more. Hunger grows not because satisfaction is absent, but because the system responsible for satisfaction no longer recognizes completion. This is how tolerance deepens the loop, by teaching the brain that there is always something missing, even when nothing truly is. Hunger in addiction is not the hunger of need, but the hunger of miscalibration. The brain is no longer measuring what is required to feel whole. It is measuring what is required to feel time's different asterisk. Each repetition shifts the internal baseline slightly upward, recalibrating what counts as relief. What once brought calm now barely interrupts discomfort. The brain does not interpret this as a signal to stop. It interprets it as evidence that the dose, the frequency, or the intensity is insufficient. This is how hunger grows without limit. The system responsible for satisfaction is quietly disconnected from the system driving pursuit, and the brain continues to seek resolution in the same direction, unaware that the reference point itself has moved. As this miscalibration deepens, hunger becomes less conscious and more pervasive. It is no longer a clear desire for something specific. It becomes a background tension, a subtle pressure that colors experience. The mind may struggle to name what is missing, only sensing that something is off. Relief, when it comes, feels fleeting and incomplete, evaporating almost as soon as it appears. This brief relief paradoxically strengthens hunger because it confirms that change is possible while proving that it does not last. The brain responds by intensifying pursuit, convinced that the answer lies in more stimulation, more repetition, more control. The tragedy of this hunger is that it feels deeply personal. It masquerades as longing, dissatisfaction, or lack of fulfillment. The brain assumes that the environment is insufficient, that life itself is under-delivering. Rarely does it question the chemistry shaping perception. Hunger becomes interpreted as truth rather than signal. The mind begins searching externally for solutions to an internally generated imbalance. And because each attempt temporarily alters internal state, the brain mistakes short-term relief for progress, even as the underlying hunger grows stronger. Over time, this unfillable hunger reshapes motivation. Actions are no longer guided by curiosity, meaning, or enjoyment, but by urgency. The brain seeks not pleasure, but silence, an end to the discomfort of wanting. Yet wanting is precisely what the chemistry maintains. Each attempt to fill the hunger reinforces the belief that hunger is real, justified, and solvable through repetition. The brain becomes trapped in a paradox. The more it tries to satisfy hunger, the more hunger it creates. Completion becomes impossible because the system driving pursuit does not recognize completion as an outcome. This is why hunger in addiction feels endless. It is not that the reward fails to satisfy it, it is that satisfaction is no longer the goal. The goal has shifted to regulation, to escape from the unease created by the system itself. The brain is chasing equilibrium in a landscape it has distorted through repetition. And until this distortion is recognized, hunger will continue to grow, not because something is missing, but because the brain has forgotten how to feel enough. As hunger remains unresolved, it begins to move beyond thought and settle into the body itself. What was once a mental restlessness slowly becomes physical. Muscles hold tension without clear cause. Breathing becomes shallow without conscious intention. Sleep loses depth. The nervous system remains slightly activated, as if waiting for something that never fully arrives. This bodily unease does not announce itself as craving. It feels more like fatigue, irritability, or a vague sense of being worn down. The brain interprets these signals as further evidence that something is missing, reinforcing the belief that relief must be sought externally. Hunger, once abstract, now has weight. Emotionally, this spread reshapes how feelings are experienced. Joy becomes fragile, easily disrupted. Calm feels temporary, almost suspicious. Negative emotions linger longer than they once did. Stress, Sadness, boredom, and loneliness begin to blur together, all carrying the same underlying message. Asterisk. This state is not acceptable. Asterisk. The brain grows less tolerant of discomfort, not because discomfort has increased, but because tolerance has decreased. Hunger lowers the threshold for distress, making ordinary emotional fluctuations feel heavier and more urgent. The loop tightens as emotional regulation becomes increasingly dependent on repetition. This dependency alters emotional memory. The brain starts to associate relief not with resolution, but with interruption. Feelings are no longer allowed to unfold and pass naturally. They are cut short, muted, or avoided. Over time, the ability to stay with emotion weakens. Sensations that once felt manageable now feel overwhelming. The hunger-driven system trains the brain to escape rather than integrate experience. Emotional depth narrows, not because emotions disappear, but because they are never fully processed. As the body and emotions adapt to this pattern, identity subtly shifts again. The person begins to see themselves as someone who is always tense, always unsatisfied, always on edge. This self-perception is not a reflection of character, it is a reflection of chemistry shaping experience. Hunger rewrites the story the body tells the mind. Fatigue is interpreted as lack. Restlessness is interpreted as desire. Emotional pain is interpreted as proof that something external must change. The internal signal is mistaken for an external problem. Eventually, hunger becomes the background state. It is no longer noticed because it is always present. The nervous system adapts to this chronic, low-level dissatisfaction, accepting it as normal. Moments without hunger feel strange, unfamiliar, even unsettling. The brain has learned to live in pursuit, and without pursuit, it feels lost. This is how hunger infiltrates the entire system, not as a dramatic force, but as a quiet constant, shaping sensation, emotion, and self-perception from beneath awareness. At this point, relief no longer feels like pleasure. It feels like temporary silence, a brief pause in the noise, and because silence is rare, it becomes precious. The brain chases it again and again, unaware that the hunger driving the chase is the very thing preventing lasting calm. This is how tolerance and hunger merge, spreading through body and emotion, turning desire into exhaustion rather than fulfillment. At this stage, hunger no longer needs an external cause to exist. It has learned how to sustain itself from the inside. What began as a response to diminished satisfaction has now become a self-generating state, produced by the very system meant to resolve it. The brain wakes already slightly dissatisfied, already leaning forward, already searching. There is no clear trigger because the trigger has become internal. Chemistry has shifted the baseline so thoroughly that absence itself feels like lack. The nervous system hums quietly with unfinished business, even when nothing is wrong. Hunger no longer asks for something specific. It simply demands change, movement, alteration, escape from the present moment as it is. This self-feeding hunger operates through a subtle distortion of perception. The brain begins to interpret neutral states as negative, stillness as stagnation, and calm as emptiness. Silence feels unfinished. Completion feels temporary. The system driving desire convinces the mind that equilibrium lies somewhere else, sometime later, just beyond reach. Each attempt to resolve this hunger briefly interrupts the discomfort, but the interruption itself reinforces the belief that the discomfort was meaningful. Relief becomes proof that hunger was justified. The brain learns the wrong lesson again and again, strengthening the loop that keeps hunger alive. As this pattern continues, the brain loses its reference for what enough feels like. Satisfaction becomes theoretical rather than experiential. The mind remembers that satisfaction should exist, but cannot recognize it when it appears. Moments of calm slip by unnoticed, dismissed as inadequate because they lack intensity. The system now values change over stability, stimulation over balance. Hunger persists not because the reward fails, but because the brain no longer trusts stillness as a valid state. It believes something must always be happening for regulation to occur. What makes this phase especially exhausting is its subtlety. There is no clear crisis, no dramatic breakdown. Life continues, but it feels heavier. Energy drains quietly. Motivation becomes effortful. The individual may sense a vague weariness, a sense of being constantly unsatisfied without knowing why. Hunger has become the background noise of existence, shaping mood, attention, and behavior without drawing attention to itself. Because it feels constant, it feels natural. And because it feels natural, it is rarely questioned. Eventually, hunger begins to consume the very resources needed to escape it. Reflection feels tiring, patience feels difficult. The brain, always leaning forward, struggles to remain present long enough to recalibrate. Each moment of awareness is quickly pulled back into motion. The hunger feeds on its own momentum, sustained by the belief that relief lies ahead rather than here. This is the final trap of tolerance, not escalation, but exhaustion, not craving, but depletion. At this point, desire has lost its original purpose entirely. It no longer points toward fulfillment or growth. It simply keeps the system running. Hunger persists because stopping would require stillness, and stillness now feels unfamiliar, even threatening. The brain has forgotten that calm does not need to be earned. It has learned to survive through pursuit, not rest. And so hunger continues to feed itself, quietly, endlessly, until something interrupts the pattern, not through force, but through understanding. There comes a point where the brain no longer experiences its actions as choices at all. Not because choice has vanished, but because the sensation of choosing has been overwritten by familiarity. Decision-making requires uncertainty, comparison, pause. The addiction system removes all three. The brain does not stand at a crossroads. It follows a well-worn path whose edges have faded from view. What once felt like desire now feels like alignment. Action arises smoothly, without inner debate, without friction. The mind narrates afterward, constructing reasons that preserve a sense of agency, but the movement itself has already happened. This is not impulsivity. It is automation masquerading as intention. Inside the brain, this shift reflects a deeper redistribution of control. Systems responsible for long-term planning and evaluation grow quieter, not because they are broken, but because they are no longer consulted. The habit system has proven itself faster, more reliable, more efficient at resolving internal discomfort. The brain prioritizes speed over accuracy when stability feels threatened. In this context, reflection becomes optional. Choice becomes redundant. The chemistry favors what reduces uncertainty immediately, even if it increases cost over time. The mind experiences this as ease. Less conflict, less thinking, less resistance, and ease feels like improvement. As conscious choice recedes, behavior begins to feel strangely inevitable. The brain interprets this inevitability as truth. This is what I want, the mind concludes, not realizing that wanting has been chemically narrowed. Alternatives feel distant, abstract, unconvincing. They require effort, imagination, tolerance of discomfort. The automated path requires none of these. It offers immediate coherence. The brain mistakes coherence for correctness. What fits smoothly feels right, even when it leads nowhere. This erosion of choice reshapes self-trust. The individual may sense a quiet disconnect between intention and action, but without a clear explanation. Promises are made sincerely and broken without drama. Motivation rises and fades without impact. The mind begins to doubt its own authority, not because it is weak, but because it is no longer in control of the system driving behavior. This doubt often turns inward, interpreted as laziness or lack of discipline, further increasing internal discomfort and strengthening the very loop that removed choice in the first place. At this stage, control has not been stolen, it has been delegated. The brain believes it has outsourced regulation to a system that works, and in the short term, it does. Discomfort resolves quickly. Order is restored. But over time, this delegation comes at a cost. The range of possible actions narrows. Flexibility diminishes. The ability to tolerate uncertainty weakens. Choice becomes effortful precisely because it has been avoided for so long. Yet within this narrowing lies an important truth. If choice feels absent, it is not because it no longer exists, it is because it has not been practiced. Choice is a function, not a trait, and functions that are unused become quiet, not gone. This realization marks the beginning of a shift, not a dramatic rebellion against the loop, but a subtle reawakening of awareness. The brain does not need force to regain choice. It needs space, time, stillness long enough to remember that action is not the only option. This is the threshold where control can begin to return not through resistance, but through recognition. When the mind notices that it is no longer choosing, choice re-enters the system, gently, quietly, without urgency. The chemistry of desire loosens its grip, not when it is fought, but when it is seen. And in that seeing, the brain begins, slowly, to remember another way of being. Control does not return to the brain through force, discipline, or sudden determination. It returns through interruption, small, quiet interruptions that slow the system just enough for awareness to re-enter. The addicted brain has not lost its capacity to choose. It has simply learned to bypass choice in favor of speed and familiarity. To call control back, the brain must experience moments where nothing immediately resolves discomfort. These moments feel unfamiliar at first. Restlessness rises, urgency whispers. The system expects movement, expects relief, expects completion. But when movement does not come, something subtle happens. Prediction begins to fail. Dopamine waits, but the expected action does not arrive. This pause, though uncomfortable, is chemically significant. It weakens the assumption that relief is automatic. The brain begins, slowly, to register that not every signal requires response. As these pauses repeat, the nervous system starts to recalibrate. The initial discomfort does not escalate into catastrophe, as the brain once predicted. Nothing breaks, nothing collapses. The body remains intact. The mind survives the absence of action. This experience is profoundly corrective. It teaches the brain something new, not through logic, but through sensation. Discomfort can exist without immediate escape. Urge can rise and fall without being obeyed. This learning happens slowly, beneath conscious thought, rewriting assumptions that repetition once engraved. Control does not return all at once. It returns in fragments, each pause restoring a small piece of choice. With time, the brain begins to tolerate uncertainty again. The space between signal and response widens slightly. Awareness arrives earlier. The mind notices the urge forming, instead of discovering it after action has already occurred. This noticing is not judgment, it is observation, and observation changes chemistry. When the brain observes an urge without acting on it, dopamine's promise weakens, prediction loses accuracy. The system driving desire becomes less confident. Confidence is what gave it power. Without certainty, it softens. As control returns, behavior begins to feel less inevitable and more optional. Not easy optional. The difference matters. Optionality restores dignity to choice. The brain remembers that it can remain present with discomfort, that relief is not the only goal, that stillness is survivable. This memory strengthens pathways associated with reflection and restraint, not through effort, but through repeated experience of safety in pause. Control is rebuilt the same way it was lost through repetition, but this time repetition of non-action. Eventually, the brain starts to reinterpret signals that once demanded response. Restlessness becomes sensation rather than command. Urgency becomes information rather than instruction. The system that once dominated behavior is no longer silenced, but it is no longer sovereign. Control returns not as dominance over desire, but as balance with it. Desire becomes a signal again, not a driver. And in this balance, the brain rediscovers something it had forgotten. Choice does not need to be loud to be real. It only needs space. As control begins to return, it does not arrive as confidence or strength. It arrives as quiet continuity. The brain slowly learns that it can remain present without being pulled forward by every signal. This presence feels unfamiliar at first, even fragile. There is no rush of relief, no dramatic shift. Instead, there is a subtle steadiness, a sense that time is no longer collapsing into urgency. Moments begin to stretch again. The mind notices space where there was once only motion. This space is not empty, it is stabilizing. It allows experience to unfold without immediate correction, without the pressure to change internal state. Stability begins here, not in achievement, but in tolerance. With repeated exposure to this steadiness, the brain starts rebuilding trust in slower systems. Reflection regains relevance. Long-term consequences become emotionally accessible again, not as abstract ideas, but as felt realities. The brain remembers that not all regulation must be immediate. Some forms of balance emerge gradually, through consistency rather than intensity. This learning does not feel exciting, it feels ordinary, and because it feels ordinary, it can persist. Stability grows not through dramatic effort, but through repeated moments where nothing urgent happens and nothing bad follows. As stability takes hold, emotional range begins to widen. Feelings are allowed to rise and fall without being interrupted. Discomfort becomes less threatening because it is no longer immediately escaped. The brain learns that sensations pass on their own. This reduces the need for intervention. Urges soften as they lose authority. They are experienced as waves rather than commands. The nervous system settles into a rhythm that does not depend on constant stimulation. Calm becomes recognizable again, not as absence, but as presence. Over time, this steadiness reshapes identity. The self is no longer defined by reaction, but by continuity. Days feel less fragmented. Attention becomes more flexible. The mind is able to move between states without clinging to any single one. This flexibility is the true marker of control returning. Not dominance over desire, but freedom from being driven by it. The brain no longer organizes itself around anticipation and relief. It organizes itself around coherence. Stability also changes how satisfaction is experienced. Pleasure becomes quieter but deeper. It lingers rather than spikes. The brain relearns how to recognize completion, how to rest in moments without searching for the next change. Hunger loosens its grip because the system driving pursuit is no longer constantly activated. Desire becomes contextual rather than constant. It arises when appropriate and fades when fulfilled. This was always its original role. In this phase, control no longer feels like effort. It feels like alignment. The brain is no longer fighting itself. Systems that once competed for dominance begin to cooperate again. Choice flows naturally because it is no longer rushed. Action becomes intentional because it is no longer automatic. Stability emerges not as rigidity, but as resilience, the ability to remain balanced through change without being pulled apart by it. This is the quiet transformation that follows awareness. Not a cure, not an endpoint, but a foundation. Control becomes something the brain inhabits rather than enforces. And from this foundation, deeper change becomes possible, not because desire disappears, but because it no longer defines the shape of experience. When control is slowly restored, desire does not disappear. It changes character. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel negotiable, not because it weakens suddenly, but because the brain no longer treats it as an emergency. Desire loses power the moment it is no longer obeyed automatically. Its strength was never in intensity alone, but in certainty. Certainty that it would be followed. Certainty that it would resolve discomfort. As this certainty dissolves, desire becomes just another internal signal noticeable, sometimes persuasive, but no longer commanding the entire system. This shift happens because the brain updates its predictions. Dopamine learns from outcomes, not intentions. When desire rises and action does not immediately follow, prediction errors accumulate. The brain expected relief, but relief did not arrive through repetition. And yet, nothing catastrophic happened. The nervous system survived the pause. Over time, these mismatches weaken the association between desire and necessity. The chemical promise loses credibility. Desire still speaks, but its voice grows quieter as the brain learns that listening is optional. As desire loses urgency, attention redistributes. The mind is no longer pulled exclusively toward anticipation. It regains sensitivity to the present moment. Subtle forms of satisfaction, rest, connection, completion, quiet become detectable again. These experiences do not spike chemistry, but they stabilize it. Stability reduces hunger. Hunger reduced reduces desire. The system begins to regulate itself without constant forward motion. This is not suppression of desire, it is integration. Desire finds its place rather than dominating the landscape. Importantly, this weakening of desire does not feel like loss. It feels like relief from pressure. The brain no longer has to chase resolution endlessly. Energy once spent managing urgency becomes available for reflection, creativity, and rest. Identity shifts again, this time away from pursuit and toward presence. The self is no longer defined by what it wants next, but by what it can remain with now. This is a profound reorientation, not of behavior, but of experience. In this state, desire becomes contextual rather than constant. It arises in response to genuine need and fades when that need is met. It no longer lingers artificially, sustained by miscalibrated chemistry. The brain has relearned completion. Satisfaction becomes possible because the system driving pursuit has stepped back. The loop no longer feeds itself. It requires external relevance to activate. And without constant activation, it weakens naturally. This is the quiet resolution of control returning. Desire does not need to be conquered or eliminated. It only needs to be seen, felt, and allowed to pass without immediate fulfillment. In that allowance, its power diminishes. The chemistry of desire no longer dictates behavior, it informs it. And when desire becomes information rather than command, freedom returns not as force, but as ease. Pain is not the opposite of pleasure in the addicted brain. It is the engine that keeps the cycle alive. Long before craving becomes conscious, subtle forms of pain begin to accumulate beneath awareness. Emotional friction, mental fatigue, unresolved tension, the quiet pressure of expectations unmet, all of these register in the nervous system as imbalance. The brain does not label this state as pain in the dramatic sense. It feels more like discomfort, restlessness, or a low-grade unease that hums in the background. Yet this hum is enough. The brain has learned that this internal pressure requires resolution, and it reaches instinctively for what once worked. Pain does not shout, it whispers, and the brain listens closely. Relief, when it arrives, feels immediate and convincing precisely because the pain was diffuse and hard to name. The contrast is sharp. Chemistry shifts, muscles soften slightly, thoughts narrow. The nervous system exhales. For a brief moment, the internal noise quiets. This relief is not joy, it is interruption. The brain does not celebrate, it stabilizes. And because stabilization feels essential, the brain records the sequence with precision. Pain preceded relief. Relief followed action. The pattern is stored, reinforced, and prepared for reuse. This is not conscious learning. It is biological bookkeeping. As the cycle repeats, the relationship between pain and relief becomes distorted. Pain grows more frequent, not because life has become harsher, but because tolerance has lowered. The nervous system becomes less resilient, more sensitive to fluctuation. Small stresses feel heavier. Minor frustrations linger longer. The brain, now accustomed to rapid relief, interprets ordinary discomfort as unacceptable. Pain expands to fill more of experience, not as suffering, but as urgency. Relief becomes necessary not to feel good, but to feel normal. This repetition reshapes emotional meaning. Pain is no longer a signal to be understood or processed. It is a cue to escape. Relief is no longer resolution. It is pause. The brain stops asking what the pain represents and focuses only on ending it. This shortcut feels efficient, but it comes at a cost. Each time, pain is interrupted rather than integrated. It returns faster and stronger. The nervous system never completes its natural cycle of activation and release. Instead, it becomes trapped in oscillation, pain rising, relief cutting it short, pain rising again. Over time, the brain begins to generate pain preemptively. Anticipation of discomfort becomes discomfort itself. The system learns to expect imbalance, and expectation alone is enough to trigger it. Pain no longer requires an external cause. It becomes a baseline state, a readiness to escape. Relief, in turn, becomes less effective. It still interrupts the noise, but only briefly. The brain responds by tightening the loop, shortening the interval between pain and relief, accelerating the cycle that created the pain in the first place. This is the cruel symmetry of the loop. Pain drives the search for relief. Relief prevents the processing of pain. Unprocessed pain accumulates, demanding more relief. The brain mistakes this cycle for regulation, unaware that it is amplifying the very state it is trying to escape. What feels like survival is actually entrenchment. The chemistry of desire feeds on pain, not because pain is desired, but because pain has become the trigger that keeps the system running. In this stage, repetition is no longer about pleasure, habit, or even desire. It is about avoiding the unbearable feeling of staying with pain long enough for it to resolve on its own. The brain has forgotten that pain, when allowed, changes. It rises, peaks, and falls. Relief interrupts this process, freezing pain in place, ensuring its return. And so the cycle continues. Pain appears, relief is sought, relief fades, pain returns each time a little faster, a little heavier, a little more convincing. This is where the loop reveals its deepest deception. It presents itself as the solution to pain while quietly becoming its source. And because this deception lives in chemistry rather than thought, it feels undeniable. The brain does not know it is repeating pain. It believes it is preventing it. Understanding this is not about blame or control. It is about seeing the pattern clearly enough that interruption becomes possible. Not interruption through relief, but interruption through presence. And that understanding is where the cycle can finally begin to loosen. Once the brain has learned to use relief as its primary regulator, the cycle no longer depends on external events to continue. It becomes self-replicating. Pain generates the need for relief, but relief itself reshapes the nervous system in a way that increases sensitivity to future pain. Each interruption prevents the system from completing its natural arc of tension and release. As a result, unresolved activation lingers beneath awareness, quietly priming the next cycle. The brain wakes already closer to imbalance than it was before. What feels like another bad moment is often the echo of the last one, never fully resolved. This unresolved activation alters how the brain interprets sensation. Normal fluctuations in mood, energy, and emotion begin to feel exaggerated. The nervous system loses its margin of tolerance. Minor discomforts register as significant disturbances. The brain responds with urgency, convinced that immediate action is required to prevent escalation. This sense of urgency is chemically real. Stress hormones rise. Attention narrows. The body prepares for resolution. And because relief has worked before, the brain does not search for alternatives. It repeats the known sequence, reinforcing the association between discomfort and escape. Over time, anticipation itself becomes painful. The brain learns to expect discomfort before it fully appears. This expectation tightens the nervous system in advance, creating the very sensation it seeks to avoid. Pain is no longer reactive, it is predictive. The system becomes trapped in a feedback loop where fear of discomfort generates discomfort, which then demands relief. The original cause disappears, replaced by a closed circuit of expectation and response. The brain is no longer responding to reality. It is responding to its own predictions. This predictive pain accelerates the cycle. The interval between discomfort and relief shortens further. There is less space for awareness, less time for choice. Action becomes reflexive. Relief arrives quickly, but it no longer resets the system. It only masks the underlying activation. Each cycle leaves a residue, subtle, cumulative, unnoticed, that increases baseline tension. The brain adapts by leaning more heavily on relief, believing that faster repetition will compensate for diminished effect. This belief keeps the loop alive. Emotionally, this self-recreating cycle erodes confidence in internal experience. Feelings are no longer trusted to resolve naturally. The brain assumes that discomfort is dangerous, intolerable, or endless unless interrupted. This assumption becomes part of identity. The person may feel fragile, overwhelmed, or constantly on edge, not because they are weak, but because their nervous system has been trained to expect instability. Relief becomes synonymous with safety, even as it quietly undermines resilience. The tragedy of this cycle is that it feels rational from the inside. Each response makes sense given the state of the system at that moment. The brain is not malfunctioning, it is adapting to conditions it helped create. Pain leads to relief. Relief prevents resolution. Prevention leads to accumulation. Accumulation leads to more pain. The loop closes cleanly, logically, relentlessly. And because it operates beneath conscious intention, it can persist even when the individual understands it intellectually. Breaking this cycle does not begin by eliminating pain or seeking better relief. It begins by allowing the nervous system to complete experiences it has long been interrupting. This feels counterintuitive, even threatening, because the brain has learned to equate interruption with safety. But only through completion can the system discharge accumulated activation. Only through remaining can the cycle lose the fuel it generates for itself. Until then, pain and relief will continue to recreate each other, quietly sustaining the chemistry of repetition. As the cycle of pain and relief continues, the body slowly stops being a place of safety and starts becoming a container of tension. The nervous system remains partially activated for so long that it forgets how to fully settle. Muscles hold readiness without purpose. Breathing stays shallow without awareness. The body learns to exist in a state of quiet preparation, as if something is always about to happen. This is not anxiety in its dramatic form. It is a low, constant alertness that feels normal over time. The brain interprets this bodily state as evidence that something is wrong, even when the environment is calm. And because the body is always present, the signal never fully disappears. This persistent activation reshapes how sensations are experienced. Physical discomfort becomes amplified. Fatigue feels heavier. Rest feels incomplete. The body no longer provides a neutral baseline from which emotions can rise and fall. Instead, it continuously feeds the brain information that reinforces urgency. The nervous system does not distinguish between external threat and internal imbalance. It simply responds, and when response becomes constant, the body itself becomes the trigger. Pain no longer needs a story. It exists as sensation alone, demanding relief through familiarity. As the body takes on this role, escape becomes a dominant theme. Not escape from life, but escape from sensation. The brain searches for anything that can shift bodily state quickly, anything that can interrupt the tension, soften the edges, quiet the readiness. Relief becomes synonymous with leaving the body, even briefly. Attention narrows. Awareness pulls away from sensation. The loop teaches the brain that presence equals discomfort and absence equals safety. This is how disconnection forms, not as dissociation, but as habit. Over time, the body's signals are no longer trusted. The brain stops listening for nuance and responds only to intensity. Subtle cues of rest, hunger, or emotional need are ignored until they become overwhelming. Regulation is outsourced entirely to repetition. The body becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. This creates a strange contradiction. The system designed to protect survival now feels like a burden. The person may feel trapped inside their own sensations, constantly seeking ways to step outside of them. This entrapment deepens the loop. Because the body never fully releases activation, pain returns faster and stronger. Relief interrupts but never resolves. The nervous system remains unfinished, always waiting for completion that never comes. The brain mistakes this unfinished state for reality itself. This is just how my body is, the mind concludes, not realizing that this state was learned through interruption. The cage is not the body, it is the pattern running through it. At this stage, freedom feels abstract. The idea of simply staying with sensation feels threatening, even impossible. The brain has learned that staying equals suffering. And yet, paradoxically, it is the constant leaving that has created the suffering. The body has not become the cage because it is broken. It has become the cage because it has never been allowed to finish what it started. Activation rises, but release is denied. Pain appears, but integration is blocked. The system is suspended in mid-process. Understanding this changes the direction of escape. Freedom is no longer found by leaving sensation, but by completing it. By allowing the body to do what it was designed to do, activate, peak, and settle. This does not happen through force or endurance, but through gentle presence, sustained long enough for the nervous system to learn a new ending. When the body learns that it can move through sensation without interruption, it stops needing escape. The cage begins to open, not because the body changed, but because the loop lost its grip. Escape feels like relief because it creates distance. Distance from sensation, distance from emotion, distance from the present moment as it is. For a brief time, the nervous system experiences quiet not because the underlying activation has resolved, but because awareness has moved away from it. This distance is often mistaken for freedom. The brain interprets the absence of sensation as safety, and safety feels like release. But escape does not change the state of the system. It only postpones it. What is avoided does not dissolve. It waits. And waiting inside the nervous system is not neutral. It is tension held without resolution. Each act of escape teaches the brain the same lesson. Asterisk presence is dangerous. Absence is safe. Asterisk. Over time, this lesson reshapes how experience itself is approached. The mind begins to fear stillness because stillness brings sensation back into focus. Silence feels heavy. Rest feels incomplete. The brain rushes toward anything that can recreate distance, even momentarily. Escape becomes automatic, not as a choice, but as a reflex. And reflexes feel trustworthy because they are fast. The brain does not ask where escape leads. It only knows that escape interrupts discomfort. But freedom does not live in interruption. Freedom lives in completion. The nervous system was designed to move through states, not around them. Activation rises, reaches a peak, and settles when allowed. Escape breaks this arc repeatedly, trapping the system in perpetual readiness. The body never finishes what it begins. Relief cuts the process short, leaving activation unresolved. This unresolved energy accumulates, making future sensations feel more intense and more threatening. Escape, meant to protect, quietly amplifies the very state it seeks to avoid. As escape becomes the dominant strategy, identity shifts again. The self is defined not by presence, but by avoidance. The person becomes skilled at leaving sensations, leaving emotions, leaving moments that feel too real. Life narrows around what can be tolerated without discomfort. The range of experience shrinks, not because the world has become smaller, but because the nervous system has learned to retreat. What feels like safety is actually confinement. The mind lives in motion, never arriving, always moving away from something unseen. True freedom feels different from escape. It does not rush. It does not promise immediate relief. It allows sensation to exist without demanding change. This feels unfamiliar, even unsettling at first, because the brain has learned to equate presence with pain. But when sensation is allowed to complete its cycle, rise, peak, and fall, the nervous system updates its understanding. It learns that staying does not destroy it, that discomfort is temporary, that presence does not require endurance forever. This learning rewrites the belief that escape is necessary. When the brain begins to trust presence again, the loop loses its final justification. There is no longer a need to flee sensation, because sensation is no longer interpreted as threat. Relief becomes natural rather than forced. Calm emerges not as absence, but as integration. Freedom is no longer defined by distance from experience, but by the ability to remain with it. And in that remaining, the chemistry of escape dissolves, replaced by a quieter, deeper stability that does not need to run. There is a moment when desire quietly changes sides. What once felt like an ally, something that promised relief, motivation, or connection, begins to work against the system it once supported. This shift does not feel sudden, it feels confusing. Desire still carries the same familiar pull, the same urgency, the same chemical charge, but the outcome has changed. Instead of restoring balance, desire now destabilizes it. The brain continues to lean forward, chasing resolution, unaware that the direction it is moving in no longer leads where it once did. The signal remains convincing even as the results deteriorate. This reversal happens because desire was never designed to operate continuously. It evolved to guide behavior toward meaningful outcomes, then fade once those outcomes were reached. But when desire is activated repeatedly without genuine completion, it loses its reference point. The brain forgets what desire was meant to serve. The chemical signal becomes detached from usefulness and begins to operate autonomously. Desire no longer points toward nourishment or growth, it points toward repetition. The brain continues to obey because it remembers the early relief, even though that relief no longer arrives. As desire turns against the system, it begins to generate the very discomfort it claims to resolve. Anticipation creates tension. Tension demands action. Action delivers brief interruption. Interruption prevents resolution. The loop tightens. Desire, once a response to imbalance, becomes a producer of imbalance. The brain experiences this as frustration rather than clarity. Wanting intensifies while satisfaction weakens. The system feels pulled forward and held back at the same time. This internal conflict drains energy quietly, steadily, without dramatic collapse. Emotionally, this phase is marked by contradiction. Desire feels urgent yet empty, compelling yet unsatisfying. The brain struggles to reconcile these signals. It assumes the problem lies in insufficient effort rather than in the signal itself. Try harder, the chemistry suggests. Go further. Each escalation feels logical within the system's distorted framework. The brain is not aware that desire has inverted its function. It still trusts the signal because it has always trusted it. Trust lingers long after usefulness fades. This is where self-blame often begins to surface. The mind senses that something is wrong but cannot locate the cause. Desire still feels internal, personal, authentic. When following it leads to exhaustion or dissatisfaction, the individual assumes the failure lies within themselves. Shame grows quietly. Shame increases discomfort. Discomfort fuels desire. The loop absorbs the emotion meant to challenge it, using it as further justification to continue. Desire turns against the self, not by force, but by misdirection. At this depth, desire no longer feels like wanting something specific. It feels like being pulled away from stillness, pulled away from presence, pulled toward motion for its own sake. The brain has learned to equate movement with hope. Even when movement leads nowhere, desire becomes a current rather than a compass. It moves the system without guiding it. Recognizing this inversion is unsettling but essential. It reveals that desire itself is not the enemy. Miscalibrated desire is. The chemistry has not become evil or broken. It has become confused through repetition without resolution. And once this confusion is seen, desire loses some of its authority. It can no longer masquerade as truth when its outcomes contradict its promises. This recognition marks the beginning of a deeper shift, not away from desire, but away from obedience to it. At this stage, desire no longer feels like a signal pointing towards something wanted. It feels like pressure, a force that disrupts balance rather than restoring it. The brain begins to register desire, not as opportunity, but as disturbance. Anticipation tightens the nervous system instead of energizing it. Thoughts become intrusive rather than motivating. The body reacts with tension instead of readiness. Desire, once associated with hope, now carries an undertone of threat. Not conscious danger, but physiological unease. The system senses that following the signal will create more instability, yet it also senses that ignoring it will create discomfort. The brain is caught between two forms of threat, unsure which one is safer. This shift occurs because desire has become predictive of loss rather than gain. The brain has learned through repeated experience that desire no longer leads to lasting relief. Each rise in anticipation is followed by disappointment, fatigue, or shame. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate the feeling of wanting with negative outcomes. Desire itself becomes stressful. The chemistry that once prepared the body for reward now prepares it for damage control. Stress hormones rise alongside dopamine. The body braces rather than leans forward. Desire transforms into a warning signal, but the system does not know how to respond to it differently. As desire becomes threatening, the brain's relationship with the future changes. Instead of imagining possibility, it anticipates cost. The mind begins to fear its own urges, sensing that they will lead to exhaustion or regret. This fear does not stop desire, it intensifies it. Suppression increases internal pressure. The urge becomes louder precisely because it is resisted. The system oscillates between avoidance and compulsion, never settling into resolution. Desire is now experienced as something that must be managed rather than followed. This internal conflict reshapes emotional tone. Anxiety creeps in quietly, not dramatic panic, but constant vigilance. The brain monitors itself closely, scanning for signs of desire, bracing for its arrival. This monitoring paradoxically keeps desire active. Attention feeds what it watches. The more the mind tries to control or eliminate desire, the more salient it becomes. The threat is no longer external, it is internal. The brain feels under siege by its own chemistry. Over time, desire's presence alone is enough to trigger stress responses. The body reacts as if danger is imminent, even when nothing has happened yet. Muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow, thoughts narrow. The nervous system prepares for impact. This preparation reinforces the belief that desire is dangerous, and because danger demands action, the loop tightens further. The brain alternates between fleeing desire and giving into it, mistaking movement for resolution. This is the moment where desire fully turns against the system. It no longer promises relief, pleasure, or connection. It promises conflict. The brain wants escape from desire itself. And yet, desire cannot be escaped because it is generated internally. This creates a sense of being trapped within one's own impulses. Freedom feels distant, not because options are gone, but because every option feels costly. Understanding this transformation is critical. It reveals that the threat is not desire itself, but the system that has been trained to respond to desire in only one way. Desire becomes threatening when it is believed to be uncontrollable. When the brain learns that desire can exist without being obeyed or suppressed, the threat dissolves. The chemistry recalibrates. Desire loses its power to alarm. It becomes information again rather than danger. And with that shift, the system takes its first step out of internal conflict and back toward balance. The threat of desire does not disappear through confrontation or suppression. It dissolves through familiarity. The brain begins to learn, slowly and quietly, that desire can arise without consequence, that nothing catastrophic follows when an urge is neither obeyed nor pushed away. This learning does not come from understanding alone, it comes from repeated experience of safety and presence. Each time desire appears and the system remains intact, prediction weakens. The nervous system expected danger. Danger did not arrive. This mismatch matters. It softens the chemistry that once prepared the body for threat. As this pattern repeats, the brain's alarm system recalibrates. Stress responses become less automatic. The body stops bracing at the first sign of wanting. Muscles release sooner. Breathing deepens without instruction. Desire begins to feel less sharp, less invasive. It still appears, but it no longer hijacks attention completely. The mind can notice the urge without collapsing into urgency. This is not control through effort, it is control through trust. Trust that sensation can exist without demanding action. This shift changes the emotional tone of desire itself. Wanting loses its edge. It no longer feels like an emergency signal demanding immediate resolution. The brain stops interpreting desire as proof that something is wrong. Instead, desire becomes a passing state, sometimes intense, sometimes mild, but no longer defining. The nervous system learns that it does not need to mobilize fully in response to every internal fluctuation. This learning restores flexibility, allowing the system to move between states without becoming trapped in any single one. As threat dissolves, attention widens. The mind is no longer consumed by monitoring desire or defending against it. Energy once spent managing internal conflict becomes available for perception, reflection, and rest. The present moment regains texture. Subtle experiences, quiet satisfaction, mild curiosity, simple completion begin to register again. These experiences do not compete with desire, they coexist with it. The brain rediscovers that meaning does not require intensity. Stability does not require escape. Importantly, desire does not vanish in this phase. It becomes honest. It reflects genuine needs rather than chemical urgency. When desire points towards something meaningful, it is felt clearly and pursued deliberately. When it points toward repetition without benefit, it loses persuasion. The brain regains discernment. Desire is no longer feared because it is no longer believed blindly. It can be evaluated, not reacted to. This is the quiet turning point where internal conflict gives way to internal coherence. The system no longer oscillates between avoidance and compulsion. It rests in observation. Desire becomes something that passes through awareness rather than something that commands it. And in this passage, the chemistry that once framed desire as threat begins to dissolve, not because desire was eliminated, but because the brain learned it could survive without obeying it. At this point, desire undergoes its final transformation. It no longer presents itself as truth, command, or destiny. It becomes what it always was beneath the chemistry and repetition: a signal, a piece of information arising within the system, carrying no authority of its own. The brain begins to experience desire without immediately assigning it meaning or urgency. Wanting appears, is noticed, and is allowed to exist without being inflated into a directive. This subtle shift changes everything. Desire loses its ability to define action because it is no longer confused with necessity. It no longer speaks louder than the present moment. This happens because the brain has relearned context. Signals are no longer interpreted in isolation, but in relationship to the whole system. Desire is weighed against stability, against long-term coherence, against the body's actual state rather than remembered relief. The nervous system no longer overreacts to internal fluctuation. A rise in wanting does not automatically trigger mobilization. The body stays grounded, attention remains wide. Desire is felt fully, but it does not collapse the field of awareness around itself. It becomes one sensation among many, not the axis around which experience turns. As desire settles into this role, its emotional charge diminishes, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer amplified by fear, urgency, or misinterpretation. The brain stops asking, what do I need to do about this? And starts asking nothing at all. Observation replaces reaction. This non-response is not passivity, it is accuracy. The system responds only when response is genuinely appropriate. Desire that points toward nourishment, connection, or growth is recognized and acted upon with clarity. Desire that points toward repetition without benefit fades on its own, deprived of the attention that once sustained it. This reclassification of desire restores internal hierarchy. Sensation no longer outranks awareness. Urgency no longer outranks coherence. The brain resumes its role as an integrator rather than a follower. Choice flows naturally, not because desire is weak, but because it is no longer confused with truth. The self is no longer organized around what it wants next, but around what it can remain present with now. This presence stabilizes the system in a way pursuit never could. In this state, desire becomes informative rather than disruptive. It signals imbalance without demanding escape. It highlights needs without dictating solutions. The brain listens, but it does not obey blindly. This listening is calm, spacious, and discerning. Desire no longer threatens stability because stability no longer depends on eliminating desire. The system has learned that it can contain fluctuation without being driven by it. This is the quiet resolution of conflict between wanting and being. Desire returns to its rightful place, not as a master, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. And when desire is understood as a signal rather than a command, the chemistry that once distorted it loses its grip. The loop does not need to be broken by force. It simply stops being fed. And in that absence of feeding, desire softens, balance deepens, and the system finally rests. Rewriting the chemistry of desire does not mean erasing it. It means teaching the brain a new ending. For a long time, the system learned through repetition that anticipation must be followed by action, and action must be followed by relief. That sequence became law, but chemistry is not fixed. It is adaptive. The same brain that learned urgency can learn patience. The same nervous system that learned escape can learn completion. Rewriting begins not with effort, but with exposure. Exposure to moments where the old ending does not arrive, and yet nothing breaks. The brain rewrites itself through experience, not intention. Each time an urge rises and is met with presence instead of repetition, new information enters the system. The chemistry expects relief through action. Action does not come. Relief does not arrive in the old way, and still the body remains. Breathing continues. Sensation shifts. The nervous system discovers something it had forgotten. Internal states are not static. They move, they change, they resolve when allowed. This discovery is subtle, but it is transformative. It weakens the assumption that the old pattern is necessary for survival. As these experiences accumulate, neural pathways begin to reorganize. Circuits once dedicated to urgency lose dominance. Slower systems, those responsible for reflection, integration, and long-term balance, grow stronger through use. This growth is not dramatic. It is quiet, incremental, almost invisible. But over time, the internal landscape changes. The baseline softens. Hunger loses its edge. Desire becomes less frequent, less intense, less convincing. The brain no longer expects constant movement to remain stable. Stillness begins to feel safe again. This rewriting also changes the brain's relationship with time. The future stops pulling so hard. The present regains depth. Moments are no longer rushed through in search of the next shift. Satisfaction becomes possible, not because rewards are greater, but because the system recognizes completion. The nervous system learns how to finish experiences rather than interrupt them. This finishing is what restores balance. It allows activation to rise and fall naturally, leaving no residue behind. Over time, the need for artificial relief fades because natural regulation returns. Importantly, rewriting the chemistry does not require perfection. Urges still appear, old patterns still surface, but their authority is diminished. Each repetition of presence over escape reinforces the new ending. The brain updates its predictions. Desire loses credibility as a driver of behavior. It becomes a signal once more noticed, evaluated, and often allowed to pass. This is how chemistry is rewritten, not by suppression, but by consistency. Eventually, the system settles into a new equilibrium, not numb, not flat, but stable. The brain no longer needs to protect itself from its own signals. Desire, pain, pleasure, and calm coexist without triggering automatic loops. The chemistry that once trapped the system now supports it. This is not the end of desire, it is the end of being ruled by it. And from this place, something deeper becomes possible, not escape, not control, but ease. For a long time, the brain believed that every rise in sensation needed an immediate conclusion. Desire had to be answered, pain had to be interrupted, tension had to be escaped. This belief was not conscious, it was learned through repetition. Teaching the brain a new ending begins by gently breaking this expectation. When sensation arises and no familiar resolution follows, the system hesitates, it waits. Dopamine predicts relief, but relief does not arrive in the old form, and yet nothing collapses. The body remains intact, awareness stays present. This moment quiet, unresolved, and safe becomes the new lesson. The brain begins to realize that endings can be different, that completion does not require escape. As these moments accumulate, the nervous system starts to remap its responses. Activation is no longer followed by urgency, but by curiosity. Sensation is allowed to move through the body without being cut short. Muscles tense, then soften. Breath deepens on its own. Thoughts rise and fall without demanding action. The system experiences something it had forgotten. Resolution is a process, not an interruption. When allowed to finish, internal states naturally return to baseline. This finishing rewrites expectation at a chemical level. The brain stops bracing for disaster when relief is delayed. This new ending reshapes memory. The brain stores experiences not just of urge and relief, but of urge and completion. These memories carry weight. They inform future predictions. The next time desire arises, the brain does not assume only one outcome. It remembers that stillness is survivable, that presence does not equal pain, that waiting does not lead to harm. Each remembered completion weakens the old loop. The system becomes less reactive, less certain, less compelled to repeat. Certainty was the fuel. Without it, desire softens. Over time, the emotional tone of experience shifts. There is less internal drama, less urgency to fix or change what is felt. The brain grows more tolerant of fluctuation. Boredom, restlessness, sadness, even longing are allowed to exist without being immediately resolved. This tolerance restores depth. Feelings regain their natural shape because they are no longer truncated. The nervous system learns how to move through experience rather than around it. This movement is what heals, not intensity, not force, but continuity. Teaching the brain a new ending is not about doing something new. It is about allowing something old to complete. The system has always known how to regulate itself. It simply forgot through interruption. Each time an experience is allowed to rise, peak, and fall, the brain updates its understanding of safety. The world feels less threatening. The self feels less fragile. Desire loses its urgency because urgency is no longer required for survival. Eventually, the new ending becomes familiar. Familiarity replaces the old loop. The brain no longer searches automatically for escape. It waits, it observes, it allows. This waiting is not passive, it is deeply active regulation. The chemistry of desire adapts to this new rhythm, aligning with presence rather than prediction. And in this alignment, the system settles into a quieter, more resilient balance, one that does not depend on repetition to feel whole. As the brain absorbs these new endings, something unfamiliar begins to emerge. Rest that does not require effort, not collapse, not numbness, not distraction, but genuine settling. The nervous system, long trained to remain alert and forward-leaning, begins to recognize moments where nothing needs to be fixed. Muscles soften without instruction, breath slows without intention. Attention widens instead of narrowing. This rest does not arrive dramatically. It slips in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, because the brain had forgotten what unforced calm feels like. There is no spike of pleasure, no chemical reward to announce it. And yet, something fundamental shifts. The system is no longer bracing. This capacity to rest rewrites the relationship between presence and safety. For a long time, stillness was associated with vulnerability. Silence felt like exposure. Now, through repeated completion, stillness begins to register as stability. The brain learns that nothing bad follows when it stays. Sensations arise and pass. Thoughts come and go. Emotions move without needing direction. The nervous system experiences continuity without urgency. This continuity is what creates resilience. It allows the system to absorb fluctuation without destabilizing. Rest becomes a state the brain can enter naturally, not something that must be earned or induced. As rest stabilizes, integration begins. Previously fragmented experiences, desire, pain, relief, calm, start to coexist within the same field of awareness. The brain no longer needs to compartmentalize or escape. Sensations that once demanded interruption are now tolerated, even understood. This integration restores coherence. The system feels whole again, not because discomfort is gone, but because it no longer defines experience. The mind regains trust in the body regains trust in sensation. This mutual trust dissolves the last remnants of the loop. In this integrated state, desire changes texture once more. It becomes softer, slower, more precise. It no longer arises from tension or lack, but from alignment. Wanting points toward genuine nourishment, rest, connection, creativity, meaning rather than repetition. And when these needs are met, desire fades naturally. There is no chase, no residue, no hunger left behind. The brain recognizes completion and rests in it. This recognition is the true reward the system had been searching for all along. Rest also alters the perception of time. Moments no longer feel like obstacles to get through. They feel inhabitable. The present moment regains thickness. The future loosens its grip. The brain is no longer pulled forward by prediction because it no longer needs escape from now. This temporal shift is subtle but profound. It allows experience to deepen rather than rush. Sleep becomes easier. Focus becomes gentler. Life feels less like a series of problems to solve and more like a flow to participate in. When the system learns to rest, the chemistry of desire completes its transformation. What once drove urgency now supports balance. Dopamine returns to its original role, guiding curiosity and learning rather than fueling compulsion. Stress response is quiet. The body no longer lives in readiness. This is not a permanent state of calm. Fluctuation still occurs, but fluctuation no longer threatens stability. The system knows how to return to rest. This is the quiet success of rewriting chemistry. Not mastery, not control, but trust. Trust that the system can feel, move, and settle without intervention. And in that trust, the final grip of the old loop releases, not with force, but with relief. At the end of this process, nothing dramatic announces itself. There is no moment of victory, no clear line crossed, no sudden sense that something has been conquered. Instead, there is a quiet absence, an absence of urgency, of pressure, of the constant pull forward. The brain no longer feels compelled to manage itself through repetition. Desire still arises, but it no longer distorts time or attention. Pain still appears, but it no longer demands interruption. The nervous system has relearned something deeply fundamental. It can remain with experience and return to balance on its own. This settling happens because the system is no longer fighting itself. For so long, chemistry was at war, anticipation pulling forward, fear pulling away, relief interrupting everything in between. Now, those forces no longer compete. They cooperate. Activation rises when appropriate and falls when complete. The body finishes what it begins. The mind follows rather than drives. This cooperation creates a sense of internal quiet that does not depend on stimulation or escape. Calm is no longer something to be achieved. It is something that remains when nothing is forcing it away. In this state, desire returns to its original role not as a force that moves the system, but as information that passes through it. Wanting is felt clearly, honestly, without urgency or distortion. When it points towards something meaningful, it is followed with care. When it points toward repetition without nourishment, it fades without struggle. The brain no longer needs to argue with desire or obey it blindly. It listens, evaluates, and remains whole regardless of the answer. What replaces the old loop is not emptiness, but spaciousness. There is room to breathe, to pause, to exist without fixing. The present moment no longer feels insufficient. It feels complete enough to rest in. Time slows because it no longer needs to be escaped. Sleep deepens because the nervous system no longer remains on watch. The body finally understands that it is safe to let go. This is not the end of desire, pain, or fluctuation. It is the end of being driven by them. The chemistry that once created urgency now supports curiosity. The systems that once demanded relief now allow completion. The brain no longer lives in anticipation of the next change. It inhabits what is here. And in that inhabiting, something essential returns, not control, not discipline, not perfection, but ease. The ease of a system that trusts itself again. The ease of a mind that no longer needs to run. The ease of a body that can finally settle into the quiet rhythm it was designed for. Here, the chemistry of desire no longer pulls you away from rest. It dissolves into it.